Palpatine didn't just take over the Republic, he embezzled it. And the banks helped him do it for 1,000 years. But this isn't a story about bankers. Not really. This is a story about the man who built the machines. The man who turned stolen money into an army of droids that would slaughter millions. The man who thought he was a titan of industry when he was actually just another line item on a ledger he couldn't read. His name was Wat Tambor, and he sounds exactly like a broken synthesizer at a rave nobody wanted to attend. That's not an insult, that's a literal description. Wat Tambor was a Skakoan, a species that requires pressure suits to survive in standard galactic atmosphere. So he wore a pressure suit everywhere. A bulky, industrial-looking thing that made him resemble a walking factory more than a living being. And that suit included a voice modulator that processed his speech into something that sounded like it was being broadcast through dying electronics. The fans call him DJ Tambor. The joke writes itself. But underneath the absurdist presentation was one of the most dangerous industrialists in galactic history. A man whose factories churned out the weapons of genocide while he nodded along at conference tables, convinced he was building an empire. He was building his own coffin. He just didn't know it yet. Before we get to Tambor's role in the greatest financial crime the galaxy ever witnessed, we need to understand the architecture he was operating within. Because Tambor didn't create the corruption. Nobody did. The corruption was older than the conspiracy exploiting it, older than the Sith Grand Plan, older than Darth Bane's rule of two, older than anyone living could remember. Ancient records suggest that the intergalactic banking clan was promised territorial concessions 3,000 years before Palpatine ever set foot in the Senate chamber. 3,000 years of accumulated grievance. 3,000 years of compound interest on resentment. The Sith conspiracy only goes back 1,000 years, to Darth Bane. The institutional rot that made it possible had been festering for 2 millennia before that. Which brings us to the point. George Lucas wasn't writing science fiction. He was writing a documentary about institutional capture, dressed up with lightsabers and space battles so we'd actually watch it. The corporations controlling the economy of the whole galaxy, that was sort of the reality of the American economy during the last 5 decades, Lucas explained in interviews. He named his Trade Federation villains Newt Gunray and Lot Dodd, transparent references to Newt Gingrich and Trent Lott. He created corporate characters as carbon copies of real politicians. And when Senator Padme Amidala delivered one of the most politically astute lines in the entire saga, she captured the transformation perfectly. It's not government that has been bought out by business. It's business becoming government. That line isn't subtle. It isn't metaphorical. It's a direct description of what happens when corporations gain literal seats in legislative bodies, when financial institutions become too big to fail, when the distinction between public service and private profit dissolves entirely. BlackRock has built a revolving door with the U.S. government so seamless that it routinely hires former government officials while preparing its C-suite executives for government appointments. J.P. Morgan emerged from the 2008 financial crisis, not diminished, but enlarged. The modern banking system implies an 87% probability, on average, that globally systemically important banks will be bailed out by their governments. Bailout isn't an emergency measure anymore. It's a business model. Now imagine that system running for 3,000 years instead of 3 decades. Imagine the banks don't just influence government, but have become government. Imagine the line between corporation and state has eroded so completely that distinguishing them requires archaeological equipment. That's the Galactic Republic, and Wat Tambor was one of its most successful products. The Techno Union manufactured much of the separatist military hardware, and Wat Tambor was the foreman. Foreman. That's what they called him. Not CEO, not chairman, not president. Foreman. As if the entire galactic industrial complex was just a particularly large manufacturing plant, and Tambor was simply the guy who kept the assembly lines running. The modesty of the title was deliberate. It obscured the actual power. Wat Tambor controlled production capacity that could arm or disarm entire civilizations. His decisions about what to manufacture and for whom, could shift the balance of power across hundreds of star systems. The foreman of the Techno Union was one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. He just didn't realize he was also one of the most expendable. To understand Wat Tambor, you need to understand what it means to be Skakoan. His species required pressure suits to survive in standard atmosphere, conditions that would kill most sentient beings. This shaped everything about how they engaged with the galaxy. Tambor spent his existence encased in that bulky industrial apparatus, his voice filtered through a vocoder that gave every sentence that distinctive electronic warble. He rose to control the Techno Union, and by the time he sat at those separatist conference tables, he had immersed himself in the practical applications of technology. How to build things, how to improve things, how to make things that worked. What he had not learned was the social architecture that determined who benefited from the things he built. This is the fatal flaw that made Tambor useful to people like Count Dooku and ultimately Darth Sidious. Tambor understood manufacturing. He understood logistics. He understood supply chains and production quotas and quality control. What he didn't understand was that he was a cog in a machine vastly larger than the Techno Union, a machine whose operators had goals that extended far beyond profit margins and market share. The separatist crisis didn't emerge spontaneously. It was cultivated, nurtured, fed resources by parties who stood to benefit from its eventual explosion into open warfare. And Wat Tambor, looking at the political landscape from behind the faceplate of his pressure suit, saw exactly what the architects wanted him to see: an opportunity. The Republic was inefficient, corrupt, bloated with bureaucracy, and hamstrung by procedural requirements that made decisive action nearly impossible. The corporations that actually produced things, that actually made the economy function, were constantly hampered by regulations written by politicians who had never manufactured anything more complex than excuses. From Tambor's perspective, separatism wasn't treason. It was rationalization. It was finally admitting what everyone already knew, that the people who built things should be the ones who decided how things were run. This is how you recruit a useful idiot. You don't lie to them. You tell them the truth, the parts of the truth that serve your purposes, and let them construct their own justifications for doing what you want them to do anyway. Tambor wasn't manipulated into believing the Republic was dysfunctional. The Republic was dysfunctional. He was manipulated into believing that the alternative being offered was genuinely better, rather than worse in ways he couldn't yet perceive. When Count Dooku convened the separatist leadership, Wat Tambor was there, sitting at that curved table in a secure facility, surrounded by beings who controlled corporations spanning the galaxy, watching as Dooku outlined the vision for a new order free from Republic interference. The Commerce Guild was represented. The intergalactic banking clan's chairman, San Hill, with his elongated Mune features and that unsettling financial predator's smile. And the Techno Union, represented by its foreman, who pledged his organization's support to Count Dooku's cause. Simple words, devastating consequences. With that pledge, Tambor committed the Techno Union's entire manufacturing capacity to the separatist cause. Every factory, every research facility, every droid production line and starship assembly bay, the industrial backbone of an entire army, signed over in a single sentence by a man in a pressure suit who genuinely believed he was making a smart business decision. What Tambor didn't know, what none of the separatist leaders knew, was that Count Dooku was apprenticed to Darth Sidious, who was also Supreme Chancellor Palpatine of the Galactic Republic. The war Tambor had just pledged to support would be fought on both sides by the same man. Every droid the Techno Union manufactured would be destroyed by clone troopers whose creation had been funded through Sith-controlled shell companies. Every credit spent on separatist military hardware was enriching the very conspiracy that would eventually destroy everyone involved. The embezzlement scheme was elegant in its complexity. To understand it, you need to follow the money. And you need to accept that the money was flowing in directions so counterintuitive that they seem like fiction. The intergalactic banking clan financed the separatist military. They extended loans to the Confederacy of Independent Systems at rates so favorable they were essentially subsidies. Very, very low interest, and in a lot of cases, no interest loans. Free money to fund a war of independence against the Republic. This same banking clan financed the Republic military. They extended loans to the Galactic Republic at an interest rate of 25%. 25%. A government facing existential military threat, with billions of lives in the balance, was being charged rates that would make a loan shark blush. Think about what this means. The banking clan was giving the separatists essentially free money to build their military, while charging the Republic usurious rates to fight against that military. They were profiting from both sides of the conflict, extracting maximum value from the Republic's desperation, while subsidizing the threat that created that desperation. And who controlled the banking clan? The Muns, whose most successful product was Higo Damask, publicly known as a wealthy financier, privately known as Darth Plagueis, Dark Lord of the Sith. Plagueis' apprentice, Darth Sidious, killed him and inherited the entire financial infrastructure, decades of accumulated investments, relationships with every major institution, and complete understanding of how to weaponize debt. Sidious, as Chancellor Palpatine, directed the Republic war effort. Sidious, as master of Count Dooku, secretly commanded the separatist forces. The banking clan funded both sides under terms that systematically drained Republic resources while minimizing separatist costs. And every droid that Wat Tambor's factories produced was paid for with money that was ultimately being stolen from the people those droids were fighting. Wat Tambor thought he was building weapons for a legitimate cause. He was actually building weapons for a puppet war designed to justify the very authoritarianism that would ultimately destroy him. The Techno Union manufactured much of the separatist military hardware, but production requires resources, raw materials, energy, skilled technicians, and most importantly, capital. Someone had to pay for all of this, and the Techno Union wasn't a charity. They were a business. Every droid they produced carried a price tag, and that price tag was ultimately paid by the banking clan's loans to the separatist government. Which means Wat Tambor was making money from the conspiracy without realizing he was also losing money to it. The credits flowing into Techno Union accounts came from banking clan loans. The banking clan was controlled by Sith-aligned interests. When the war ended, when Sidious declared himself emperor, all of that debt would still be outstanding, owed to institutions that Sidious now controlled absolutely. The Techno Union's profits were illusory. They were just numbers on a ledger that Sidious would eventually erase, along with everyone who thought those numbers meant something. Darth compound interest. That's essentially what Sidious was. Darth leveraged buyout. Darth hostile takeover. The Sith hadn't abandoned their philosophy of power. They'd just realized that power in a complex galactic economy flows through financial institutions, not lightsaber duels. Why kill your enemies when you can indebt them? Why conquer worlds when you can foreclose on them? Wat Tambor didn't understand any of this. He understood production quotas and manufacturing efficiency. He understood that the separatist contracts were lucrative, and that victory would mean even more lucrative opportunities in a new, corporate-friendly galactic order. What he didn't understand was that he was being milked like livestock, fattened up for a slaughter that would come the moment he was no longer useful. The evidence of Tambor's moral character, or lack thereof, is documented in the Clone Wars themselves, not in abstract strategic decisions, but in the very nature of what he manufactured and for whom. Consider what the Techno Union was actually producing. Battle droids by the millions, mechanical soldiers designed to kill sentient beings, weapons systems deployed against civilian populations, manufacturing capacity converted from peacetime industry to instruments of mass destruction. And Tambor presided over all of it, approving contracts, allocating resources, optimizing production without ever asking the fundamental question: what were these weapons actually for? The banking clan's practices reveal the ecosystem Tambor operated within. They utilized hired mercenaries to collect debts, not politely worded letters, but actual armed thugs arriving to encourage payment. They invested in thousands of Hailfire droids specifically to intimidate defaulting clients, not to use against military enemies, to threaten debtors. A bank that maintains its own private army of combat robots pointed at its customers is not a bank. It's a protection racket with better paperwork. When clients couldn't pay, the banking clans seized everything. Ships, factories, planetary defense forces, all of it converted into separatist military equipment. A transport company that missed a payment might see its ships reflagged as separatist supply vessels. A manufacturing corporation that defaulted might watch its factories retooled for battle droid production. And Wat Tambor's techno union was right there, ready to absorb the seized industrial capacity, ready to integrate the confiscated factories into its own production networks. The ecosystem of exploitation was circular and self-reinforcing. Predatory lending created defaults. Defaults created seizures. Seizures created resources for military production. Military production sustained the war. The war created more desperate borrowers, more defaults, more seizures, more production. Round and round, with Tambor's factories at the center of the wheel, churning out droids and weapons, while credits flowed through channels he never examined too closely. This is what George Lucas was showing us. This is the reality behind the absurd presentation. DJ Tambor, with his broken synthesizer voice and his industrial pressure suit, was a monster. Not because he was evil in the melodramatic Sith sense. He probably never killed anyone personally, never felt the dark side's seduction, never engaged in the theatrical villainy that makes antagonists memorable. He was a monster because he was banal, because he reduced sentient beings to production inputs, because he could authorize weapons manufacturing and then discuss quarterly projections in the same meeting, without any sense that the two activities were morally distinct. Our Wat Tambors wear better suits. They speak in frequencies we've learned to ignore. They testify before congressional committees in perfectly modulated tones, while their companies do exactly what the techno union did: manufacture the machinery of destruction and call it innovation. The separatist council meetings must have been fascinating exercises in collective delusion. Picture the scene: a curved table in some secure facility, surrounded by powerful corporate executives from across the galaxy. San Hill of the banking clan, with his elongated moon features and his predator smile. Representatives of the Commerce Guild, and Wat Tambor, in his bulky pressure suit, his vocoder converting every word into that distinctive electronic warble. They thought they were equals. They thought they were architects of a new galactic order, planning together, collaborating, building something that would outlast the corrupt republic and create opportunities for corporate governance on a scale never before achieved. They sat at that table and discussed strategy and resources and political developments, imagining themselves as the power behind Count Dooku's throne. Meanwhile, Dooku reported to Sidious. Sidious controlled the Republic. The banking clan's loans were enriching Sith-aligned interests, regardless of which side won any particular battle. And every single being at that conference table was scheduled for execution the moment they stopped being useful. The useful idiots. That's what they were. San Hill, who thought he was playing the game when he was actually the game piece being played. Corporate executives whose factories were building weapons that would ultimately be turned against their own interests. Tambor, whose techno union was manufacturing the instruments of a war designed to justify its own suppression. None of them understood that the corruption they were exploiting was being orchestrated by the very people they thought were their allies. They saw a dysfunctional republic and assumed the dysfunction was organic, natural, fixable through regime change. What they didn't see was that the dysfunction was manufactured, that Sidious wanted the republic to be corrupt, needed it to be corrupt, was actively cultivating every scandal and inefficiency that pushed corporate leaders towards separatism. Every argument Tambor made for joining the Confederacy was correct. The Republic was bloated. The bureaucracy was inefficient. Corporate interests were constantly hampered by political interference. All true. All deliberately engineered to be true. so that people like Tambor would draw exactly the conclusions they drew and take exactly the actions they took. The Sith didn't need to lie to their marks. They just needed to tell them the parts of the truth that served Sith purposes. The financial structure of the Clone Wars deserves forensic examination, because this is where Tambor's story intersects with the larger embezzlement scheme in ways that reveal the true scale of the crime. The Techno Union manufactured military hardware. That hardware required raw materials, energy, labor, and capital. The capital came from banking clan loans to the separatist government. Those loans were extended at minimal or zero interest, essentially giving the separatists free money to purchase Techno Union products. So far, this looks like a good deal for Tambor. Free money flowing to his customers, who use it to buy his products. Revenue without the usual credit constraints. But follow the money one step further. The banking clan's ability to extend low-interest loans to the separatists was subsidized by high-interest loans to the Republic. 25% interest on loans to a government fighting for its survival, compared to essentially 0% for the government trying to destroy it. The differential was extracting wealth from the Republic and using it to fund separatist operations. And who directed Republic war spending? Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, who was also Darth Sidious, who also controlled the separatists through Count Dooku. The Republic was paying premium rates to fight an enemy that was being funded by the same financial institutions extracting those premium rates. Every time a clone trooper destroyed a battle droid on some contested battlefield, the Republic was paying interest on the loans that financed both the clone and the droid. The war itself was a wealth extraction mechanism, designed to drain Republic resources while enriching the financial institutions that Sidious would eventually bring under direct Imperial control. Tambor's Techno Union was getting paid, yes, but they were getting paid with money that was borrowed from institutions whose ultimate loyalties were not to the separatist cause, but to the Sith conspiracy that controlled both sides of the war. When the war ended, when Sidious declared himself emperor and Order 66 executed the Jedi, what would happen to all that debt? What would happen to the contracts and the credits and the financial relationships that made the Techno Union profitable? The answer is obvious in hindsight. They would belong to the Empire. Everything would belong to the Empire. The manufacturing capacity that Tambor had built, the factories and the research facilities and the assembly lines, would be seized and repurposed. The debts that the Techno Union owed would be called in by institutions now under Imperial control. The executives who had managed those operations would be eliminated, because they knew too much and had served their purpose. Tambor was building his own replacement. Every droid his factories produced, every weapon system his engineers designed, every manufacturing technique his organization developed, all of it would eventually serve the empire that emerged from the war's ashes. He was training his successors, stocking their inventories, solving their production problems. And when the transition came, he would be removed with the efficiency of a defective component being swapped out of an assembly line. The war was supposed to end. That's the part the separatist leaders never understood. They thought they were fighting to win, to establish the Confederacy as a permanent alternative to the Republic. But Sidious never intended for the separatists to win. He never intended for the Republic to win either. He intended for the war to continue until the Republic was sufficiently damaged and desperate to accept authoritarian transformation. And then he intended to end it, on his terms, with himself in absolute power. The separatist leadership was always scheduled for liquidation. They were assets to be exploited during the war and eliminated afterward, because they knew too much about how the conspiracy operated. Sandhill knew the financial architecture. Tambor knew the manufacturing infrastructure. None of them could be allowed to survive and potentially expose the truth of what had happened. Mustafar was the cleanup operation. Darth Vader, newly christened with his Sith name, walked into that conference room where the Separatist Council had been gathered by Count Dooku's final instructions. They thought they were meeting an ally. They thought the war was winding down in their favor. They thought the future they had been building was finally arriving. Vader ignited his lightsaber and the future arrived differently than expected. Wat Tambor died on Mustafar, the foreman of the Techno Union, the industrial genius who had pledged his organization's support to the separatist cause, who had built weapons and directed production, who had believed until the very end that he was a player in the game rather than a piece on the board. Vader's lightsaber carved through his body in that conference room with the rest of them. No severance package, no golden parachute, no negotiated exit. Just a lightsaber through the pressure suit and a spot in the historical footnotes as one of the many idiots who thought they could ride the tiger without getting eaten. The Techno Union's assets were absorbed into imperial infrastructure. The factories became imperial factories. The research facilities became imperial research facilities. The production techniques that Tambor's engineers had developed went into manufacturing imperial weapons, imperial starships, imperial droids. Everything the Techno Union had built served the empire that emerged from the war's ashes. And the debts? The financial obligations that the Techno Union had accumulated during the war, borrowing from banking clan institutions to fund expansion and operations? Those debts were owed to institutions that Sidious now controlled absolutely. The Emperor could call them in or forgive them as suited his purposes. He could use them as leverage against any surviving Techno Union executives who hadn't been eliminated. Or he could simply seize everything and let the accounting sort itself out later. This is what Palpatine achieved that no Sith Lord before him had achieved. Not just conquest, but ownership. The galaxy wasn't defeated, it was acquired. A leveraged buyout funded by its own pension accounts. And Wat Tambor, with all his manufacturing genius and technical expertise, had been a critical component of that acquisition. He had built the weapons that justified the emergency powers. He had sustained the war that drained Republic resources. He had provided the industrial capacity that made the transformation possible. Without Tambor and the Techno Union, the Clone Wars might have ended differently, or ended sooner, or never achieved the scale that made authoritarian transformation seem necessary. But Tambor didn't understand any of this. He understood production quotas and profit margins and manufacturing efficiency. He understood that the separatist contracts were lucrative and that victory would mean opportunities for expansion. What he didn't understand was that he was a tool, being used for purposes that would eventually require his elimination. The lesson of Wat Tambor is not that he was uniquely evil. Other beings did worse things during the Clone Wars. The lesson is that he was banal, that he was a competent professional doing his job well, without ever stepping back to ask who he was really working for, or what purposes his competence served. This is what Lucas was warning us about. Not Sith Lords with red lightsabers and dramatic capes, but corporate executives in pressure suits who authorize weapons production and then discuss quarterly projections in the same meeting. The banality of evil, dressed up in science fiction clothes so we might actually pay attention. Some argue that real-world financial institutions, the IMFs, the World Banks, the BlackRocks, serve important functions, help developing nations, provide capital access, stabilize markets. And there's truth in that argument. There are economists who genuinely believe it, who can point to data and outcomes and make a credible case. The banking clan's victims would disagree about whether that access was worth the price of their sovereignty. But let's not pretend the debate is simple. What we can say with certainty is that Lucas was making a specific artistic choice. He was drawing specific parallels. He was embedding actual economic critique in the structure of his universe. Whatever you believe about real-world institutions, Lucas clearly believes something specific about them. And he put that belief on screen. The final irony of Wat Tambor's story is that his pressure suit, that bulky industrial apparatus that kept him alive in standard atmosphere, was also a perfect metaphor for his existence. He could only survive inside a protective bubble. Outside that bubble, the universe would kill him. And he never realized that the bubble wasn't protecting him from the universe. It was isolating him from the truth of what he was participating in. Inside his bubble, Tambor saw profit margins and production efficiency. Outside his bubble, civilizations were being crushed, populations were being brutalized, a conspiracy was being executed with precision that required everyone to stay inside their bubbles and focus on their own metrics. The Skakoans required pressure suits to survive. They couldn't survive without them. But pressure can be metaphorical as well as physical. The pressure to meet quotas. The pressure to satisfy contracts. The pressure to compete in markets that reward efficiency over ethics. Tambor was a creature of pressure in every sense, and the pressure that shaped him also blinded him. When Vader's lightsaber carved through Tambor on Mustafar, his existence ended. But metaphorically, he had been dead for years, dead to the reality of what he was doing, dead to the consequences of his choices, dead to everything except the numbers on his screens and the contracts on his desk. George Lucas showed us the corporate separatists with deliberate absurdity. DJ Tambor with his broken synthesizer voice. San Hill with his stretched features and predatory posture. The whole gallery of alien executives sitting at their conference table, discussing strategy for a war they thought they understood. The presentation was almost cartoonish, but the critique underneath was deadly serious. These weren't exotic alien villains. They were recognizable types. The industrialist who doesn't ask questions about how his products are used. The banker who extracts maximum profit from desperate borrowers. The executive who authorizes harmful policies and then insulates himself from the consequences with legal structures and corporate shields. We know these people. We see them testifying before our legislative bodies, speaking in carefully modulated tones, expressing concern while their companies continue practices that harm millions. We see them rotating between corporate boardrooms and government appointments, their expertise at extraction making them valuable in both contexts. We see them collecting bonuses while their organizations pay fines that represent a fraction of their profits. Lucas put them in pressure suits and gave them alien faces, but he was drawing from observation. The Trade Federation's blockade of Naboo was corporate military action. The banking clan's financing of both sides of the Clone Wars was arms dealer neutrality. The Techno Union's manufacturing of weapons of mass destruction was the military-industrial complex stripped of its patriotic rhetoric. And Wat Tambor, DJ Tambor, with his absurd voice and his industrial aesthetic, was the face of industrial complicity. The man who built the machines without caring what the machines were for. The man who focused on efficiency metrics while ignoring ethical implications. The man who died on Mustafar, still not understanding that he had been a tool, used and discarded by people who never saw him as anything more than a production input. The 1,000-year Sith conspiracy succeeded because people like Wat Tambor existed at every level of galactic society. People who focused on their jobs, their metrics, their immediate incentives, without ever stepping back to examine the larger system they were participating in. The Sith didn't need to corrupt the galaxy personally. They just needed to create conditions where corruption was profitable and oversight was impossible. They needed people who would stay inside their bubbles. And that brings us back to the beginning. To Palpatine, who didn't just take over the Republic, but embezzled it. To the banks that helped him do it. To the industrial combines that manufactured the weapons of their own destruction. To the executives who sat at conference tables believing they were architects when they were actually materials. The Clone Wars weren't a war. They were a hostile takeover disguised as a conflict. Both armies were ultimately controlled by the same person. Both sides' financing ultimately enriched the same interests. The millions of clone troopers and the battle droids were just cover for a transaction that was always going to end the same way, with everything belonging to Darth Sidious. Wat Tambor's role in this transaction was simple. He manufactured product. He met production quotas. He filled orders without asking where the orders came from, or who ultimately benefited from the orders being filled. He was good at his job. Excellent, even. The Techno Union under his leadership was one of the most efficient industrial operations in galactic history. And his reward for that excellence was a lightsaber through the pressure suit. Because excellence in service of exploitation is still exploitation. Efficiency in manufacturing weapons of oppression is still complicity. Professional competence, when deployed without ethical examination, is just another tool for people with worse intentions to exploit. The banking clan intimidated debtors, gave coercive loan terms, seized property from defaulted loans, maintained private armies to threaten non-compliant clients, financed wars on all sides to maximize profit and political leverage. They were promised territorial concessions 3,000 years ago and spent every subsequent century finding ways to collect on that promise. And Wat Tambor's techno union was their industrial partner, converting predatory finance into weapons production, turning seized assets into battle droids, manufacturing the machinery of oppression at galactic scale. Thank God we live in a more civilized age. George Lucas tried to warn us. He dressed his warning in space opera clothes, gave it lightsaber fights and dramatic music, surrounded it with spectacle designed to attract attention. He made the villains alien and absurd, hoping that the absurdity would let us see them more clearly. We watched a documentary and complained about the dialogue. Maybe that was inevitable. Maybe the truth is that you can't warn people about institutional capture while they're experiencing it, because the institutions doing the capturing also control the systems that would allow people to recognize what's happening. Maybe Lucas understood that the first generation of viewers would miss the point, and hoped that subsequent generations, armed with bitter experience and the hindsight that comes from watching real institutions behave exactly like fictional ones, would eventually recognize what he was trying to say. Wat Tambor was a useful idiot. He thought he was building an empire. He was building a catapult, designed to launch someone else into power and then be discarded. Our Wat Tambors are still building catapults. They're still filling orders without asking who benefits. They're still focusing on efficiency metrics while ignoring ethical implications. They're still inside their bubbles, protected from the atmosphere that would kill them, blind to the larger picture of what they're participating in. The Techno Union pledged its army to Count Dooku. The army destroyed and was destroyed, exactly as planned. The foreman who pledged that army died on Mustafar, exactly as planned. And the factories that built that army were absorbed into imperial infrastructure, exactly as planned. The plan worked. The Sith won. The galaxy got 1,000 years of corporate rot crystallized into authoritarian governance. If you found this prosecution compelling, if you want to see more cases where fiction reveals truth that nonfiction conceals, subscribe for more stories like this. The evidence is all around us. Someone just needs to present it to the jury.